Okay. Ani, Sego, hello, bonjour, and welcome to Shared Paths webinar, Setting a Baseline, to what extent are Indigenous communities recognized in the official plans of Ontario municipalities. My name is Morgan Peters, some of you know me. I'm the Manager of Operations at Shared Path. To start us off officially, I'm going to welcome Shared Path co-founder and board chair Carolyn King. She is the first woman to have been elected as chief of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. She has over 25 years of experience in the field of First Nations community and economic development, and extensive experience in public relations, environmental planning policies and procedures, and community radio. She's a board member on numerous local community-based organizations and has served at the municipal, regional, and national levels. She has received numerous awards, including the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, in recognition of her support for First Nations history and the advancement of Aboriginal peoples. And you might have heard of a little project called the Moccasin Identifier Project, which she spearheaded and is doing great work with. So Carolyn, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and please take it away.
Honey, Dijnakar's Carolyn King, as you buy a new credit. Means that my name is, and I live at New Credit, the First Nation, and that most of the Golden Horseshoe area is in the treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that so when we talk from Toronto, we are in Treaty 13, and that I always like to make sure that people know about that, because it's an important part of any planning. So on behalf of the Mississauga, I'm a member. I've lived here for 50 years now. So on behalf of the Mississaugas of the Credit, welcome to our treaty lands and territory, and best of luck for all the information that we're going to get today, and that if you have any questions, Shared Path is here to serve you. Chimigwich.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carolyn. And now I'm going to introduce Dali Carmichael. Dali became a member of Shared Path last September at our AGM as a student, and then she approached us at the beginning of this year of 2020 to see if she could complete an internship with us as part of her master's degree. And we said, yes, please. She is studying in the Faculty of Environmental Studies and is focused on Indigenous interactions with land use planning and extractivism. She's also a producer at the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project and a former journalist. So she is here today to discuss her project with us and some of her findings. So here's a little introduction to her. And now I'm going to ask Dali to take over the screen and let us see some of what she's been working on.
Right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, Morgan. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm also presenting from Treaty 13 territory of the Toronto Purchase. These lands are traditional territory and have been taken care of by many nations, including, as Carolyn mentioned, the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The territory is also subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and an agreement, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So I'm just going to pull up my screen a little bit, and then we will jump into some of the work that I've been doing with Shared Path over the last couple of months. Right. So just a brief introduction into what we're going to get into today. Today we'll be talking about how official plans, kind of where they stand right now and how they could be used to overcome some jurisdictional gaps between municipal communities and First Nations communities in terms of land use planning. I'm going to talk about why we're focusing on official plans. I'm going to share some of the research that I've been doing with Shared Path, and then I'm going to share some of the lessons, examples, and further learning that could be opportune for the future. So as Morgan said, this is just another brief introduction to me and who I am. I also want to plug, on top of the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project, they're doing some great work with youth and around education and informing people what's going on in Indigenous communities. I also did some work with Finding Flowers, which is a project out of York University. It's led by Sheila Kola and Lisa Myers. They're both great principal investigators, and it's all around using traditional environmental knowledge along with kind of Western conceptions of science to conserve pollinators and use art to share information about that. So that's a really great project that's going on. I also want to talk about being a former journalist for a minute, just because it is kind of how I came to this work around planning and its interactions with Indigenous peoples. I've spent the last 8 years or so working with different communities as a journalist, from Ottawa to the Northwest Territories to Northern Alberta. It's just a topic that came up a lot in my work as a journalist, and I decided I wanted to learn more about it. So that's why I'm doing my master's and learning that way. So I just want to take a moment to talk about the language before I jump into the full presentation. I've been taught that when you're speaking about Indigenous peoples or you're talking about Indigenous communities, the best thing to do is to consult with the community on how they want to be regarded or referred to. The next best things are kind of using, you know, kind of common nomenclature like First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, kind of more general, or using the term Indigenous peoples to be inclusive of and recognize their different heritages and different cultures. The terms Indian and Aboriginal will come up in this conversation. They are colonial legal terms under the Indian Act and some other existing legislation and policy. So they will be referred to, but they're not by any means what I would normally refer to people as, other than those circumstances. So why are we talking about a jurisdictional gap? Why are we asking the question, to what extent are Indigenous communities recognized in the official plans of Ontario municipalities? There's a jurisdictional gap between First Nations and non-First Nations communities that makes it really difficult to collaborate in matters of land use planning. And what do I mean by jurisdictional gap? Essentially, it comes down to the fact that constitutionally, there's no obligation for First Nations and municipalities to have any sort of relationship. This is because under Section 92 of the Constitution Act of 1867, it places municipalities and their lands under the responsibility of provincial governments, whereas Section 91 of the same act places Indigenous peoples and their lands under the responsibility of the federal government. And I kind of want to take a minute to talk about what this means in the planning realm. So Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes and affirms Aboriginal treaty rights. Treaty rights are determined in treaty agreements signed between the Crown and various First Nations. These are not perfect agreements. We know that not all First Nations in what is now known as Ontario are party to treaties. We also know that not all of these treaties were negotiated and signed in good faith, and as a result, there are ongoing land claim processes and modern treaties being developed across Canada. I also want to talk about Aboriginal rights and what that means specifically. So we have treaty rights that come from these treaties. They've been signed into existence. There's also Aboriginal rights, which stem from the existence of Indigenous peoples within what is now known as Canada, previous to contact with settlers. So these rights are tied to the land, its various uses in Indigenous legal and governance orders, economies, and cultures that existed before settlers came here. So tying that back into this conversation of the jurisdictional gap, it's clear that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups of people have interest in the land, how it's used, how it's planned, and there are practical reasons that First Nations and municipalities should be coordinating with one another. I was talking to our board member, David Stinson, who's going to be presenting after me, about this yesterday as we were preparing for this presentation, and he described the land as kind of a cultural touchstone, as an entity that both parties want decision-making power over for a variety of reasons. So what exactly does that relationship look like right now? Basically, it comes down to varying degrees of consultation. So as a part of Canadian jurisprudence, the Supreme Court of Canada has established that Aboriginal peoples asserting Aboriginal and treaty rights must be consulted and accommodated prior to any decision-making conduct or activities that may have an impact on the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous consultations by municipalities has also been enshrined in the provincial policy statement in Ontario since 2014. Again, David is going to talk more to this in his presentation following mine. He'll provide a little bit more context on kind of where that's at now. But I do just want to touch on a couple of things before I go into further into my presentation. First of all, under the 2014 policy statement, planning authorities are encouraged to coordinate planning matters with Aboriginal communities, and as well, this provincial policy statement shall be implemented in a manner that is consistent with the recognition and affirmation of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. So that's just kind of a bit of context to have going into this discussion. Excuse me. So I want to mention an article that's been really foundational to the work that I've been doing. A few people have shared it with me throughout this work. It's called Finding Common Ground, a critical review of land use and resource management policies in Ontario, Canada, and their intersection with First Nations. It's an article that I've relied heavily on in doing this line of research. It was written with contributions from Carolyn, who spoke earlier, as well as Janet McBeth from Walpole Island First Nations Heritage Center, and several researchers from Queen's University, including Fraser McLeod, Leela Viswanathan, and Graham Whitelaw. So I just want to read a section from that article because I think that it really summarizes kind of what we're getting at today really well. And so they say that our partnership stems from ongoing conversations about the need to influence provincial policy, both to improve municipal First Nations relations and to enhance dialogue and improve planning within a culture that has historically situated First Nations issues, claims, and knowledge only peripherally. With consultation mainly occurring today on a project-by-project basis, First Nations often do not have the capacity to influence decision-making. New funding opportunities in the province for communities, including Ontario's New Relationship Fund, are changing that reality incrementally, but there remains a concern amongst our emerging partnership that meaningful change will not be able to sustain itself without amendments to higher guiding policies. Improvements to policy at the strategic level are required to enable improved on-the-ground planning relations. So, in the study that they did, they looked at tons and tons of legislation, regulation, policy statements, provincial plans, technical documents from multiple ministries. And essentially they came to the conclusion that planning can provide an opportunity to create spaces of common ground, but to do so requires, among other steps, reworking higher policies, including restrictive federal policies through First Nations participation, and voices to give clarity and direction on how to build and sustain relationships between First Nations and neighboring non-First Nations communities. So that's, again, just giving a little bit of background going into this discussion. Another document that I've relied on in this research is the Association of Ontario Municipalities document they released in 2019. It's called Municipal Governments and the Crown's Duty to Consult Towards a Process That Works for Local Communities. They pose the question, what is a municipality's duty to consult around municipal issues? And they kind of conclude that it should be left up to other entities. They believe it's the responsibility of the federal government or corporations that are carrying out different development practices. And they also say that if it is decided that it's to be carried out by municipalities, more resources need to be provided to train staff on how to conduct this kind of consultation and to actually carry out the consultation work. I don't necessarily agree with their findings. Some of their findings kind of hinge on the legal imperatives to conduct this kind of work. But I think that the article does kind of allow us to ask further questions about, you know, how is consultation carried out? What are the circumstances that it's carried out in? Are there policies or guidelines on how to conduct this consultation? So I think it's an interesting article to revisit. They have some really good resources. They have some really good information about kind of the history of this conversation. OPPI and CIP have also put out policies in the last couple of years that have made similar calls, mostly about the training of planners around Indigenous histories and land use histories. I also just want to take a moment here and talk about kind of the ideas of stakeholders versus rights holders. So in planning, you know, we kind of talk about stakeholders as different governments, different residents, community organizations, businesses with vested interest in how planning is conducted. Often Indigenous peoples, First Nations are included as stakeholders, but I think it's really imperative that planners recognize that Indigenous peoples are not just stakeholders, but they actually distinct rights holders. So in finding common ground, they characterize First Nations as planning partners versus planning stakeholders. And this relates back to those discussions around Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which again recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights that were not created by the Canadian state, but Indigenous legal orders that predate colonizers. So I just wanted to have that in the back of your mind as we're going through this discussion. Oops. So next, a little bit about the research. Why look at official plans? Why are they a site that we can focus some of this work on? As I was speaking to Carolyn about this research that we were doing, and we were preparing for this presentation, she emphasized to me, and she's emphasized in other conversations we've had, but this one specifically, she said that, you know, if you have an idea or if you have a goal that you want to be taken really seriously by a municipality, you have to put it in the official plan. These documents are visionary, they're forward-thinking pieces of policy, and they codify long and short-term goals of a municipality. So basically, if you have it in the plan, it's out there, people are aware of it, it's more likely to get some eyes and action, I guess, dedicated to it. I also wanted to look at official plans because it helps with shared path. I don't know how many of you folks watching are familiar with it, but shared path has been creating a database of documents for its members. This includes legislation, academic articles, protocols, and statements coming from Indigenous communities, legal archives, etc. And so we saw this as a way to collect official plans all just in one space and make them accessible for people who are members of Shared Path. So I've been helping with that data collection as well. Through this work, we've created a living document. It's a spreadsheet that records which plans exist, which are under review, etc. And also, as I've been doing this work, some of this is just for me and my own learning. Some of this is also for you know, maybe municipalities that are starting to do this work and acknowledging treaty history and acknowledging Indigenous histories. But I've also been tracking treaties and which treaties apply to different municipalities as part of the spreadsheet. So I'll show it in a couple of slides, but I just wanted to take a beat and talk about why I'm looking at treaties versus traditional territories and the difference between the two things. So treaty territories, again, they're related to colonial documents. They are agreed upon by First Nations and the Crown. They're mappable and they're codified within our laws. Traditional territories, they are a little bit more complicated to kind of navigate. They go back more to Indigenous legal orders. They aren't as well recognized by the Crown and by Canadian systems. And so to do that work justice, to map out traditional territories and to understand what area belongs to whom and where there might be discrepancies and whatnot, it would really take a lot of work, and that's just beyond the scope of what we were able to do in this time. So I've talked to several board members about this. It does seem like this is something that you know, is an adventure, some research that they would like to take on down the line. But again, it's about having the resources to be able to take on that kind of work. So to do this work, essentially what we did was we decided to look at all of the official plans in Ontario and see in which ways they talk about Indigenous peoples. We came up with a list of key terms: First Nation, Métis, Indigenous, Treaty, Aboriginal, Indian. These are all kind of both used in just common nomenclature as well as legal documents. Like the Finding Common Ground study, I decided to use latent and manifest content analysis. So essentially, I was looking for the key terms and then using those key terms to see how the official plans kind of discuss their relationships with Indigenous communities. I didn't include the Far North Act or communities within the jurisdiction of the Far North Act because it's just a different way of organizing communities. And again, it was just kind of beyond the scope of what I was able to do in the study. It would take on a whole other leg of research, I believe. I think that's all I wanted to hit on there. Oh, I also wanted to talk about native land. This was the resource that I used to map out the treaties as I was going through the research. It's not totally perfect. They have a disclaimer on their website that you know, they've kind of done the best to do due diligence, but you know, it's never going to be 100% perfect, I don't think. There are other services out there that do similar work, but I think Native Land is really interesting because when you look at the organization, they have lots of Indigenous peoples from across Canada, mostly in British Columbia, but you know, they're on the board, they're making decisions about how the organization operates, and also the way that they prioritize information is really interesting. If you read their kind of about description, they say that they prioritize information coming from Indigenous nations and communities over other resources. They do use other resources to kind of help fill in the gaps, but really most of the information is coming from communities themselves, which I think is really very cool. So we're still kind of undergoing this work. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the preliminary results. So we defined 320 municipalities within Ontario. This work was done by Karen Travers, who is not currently working with Shared Path anymore, but she was at one point, and she put together kind of the basis of this research for us, which was great. As of today, we've reviewed 219 municipalities. Of those municipalities, 11 are lower tier municipalities that don't have their own official plans. So that's something to keep in mind as we're going through some of the information. Out of the 219 municipalities that we've reviewed to date, 121 of them have contained at least one of those keywords that we mentioned before. I do want to talk about the keywords for a minute because there's some interesting information that kind of came out of that. First of all, out of all of the, I'll just go back for 1 second. Out of all the key terms that we used, First Nations turned up the most results by far. Some of that is because if official plans are addressing specific nations, it would kind of be like Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, or, you know, kind of the proper term, so that would come up a lot. We also noticed that the word Indigenous often did not refer to people, but to plants. It often came up when official plans were referring to the environment, when they were talking to native plant species and how to protect them rather than peoples. I mean, this could be a sign of a good or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. If you're using kind of, like I said earlier, those more specific community names, maybe it's not a bad thing that you're not seeing the word Indigenous very often, but if you're seeing kind of, you know, just as a broad spectrum of conversation or a broad topic to be covered, maybe it's not great that you're not seeing the word Indigenous. I don't know, that remains to be analyzed a little bit more. The word Métis, if it was mentioned at all, it was often lumped in with First Nations. The word treaty only came up sometimes in cultural or historical statements or land acknowledgements. There wasn't much actual engagement with treaty and treaty history in terms of things that are actionable. Also, the word Indian has only come up once so far, which is pretty good to see. And it was a place name. It was the Indian Harbor in Georgian Bay. So just some interesting little notes going into the discussion. So out of this research, there are 6 kind of themes that emerged that I found in the different official plans. They focused on culture, settlement history, archaeology, environmental impact studies, consultation, and collaboration. By far, the most popular one that I saw was archaeology. And I believe that's just because of the way that legislation in Ontario works. Yeah, so the way that legislation, we have the Environmental Assessment Act, we have the Planning Act, and we have the Heritage Act, and those have very strict guidelines about how archaeological studies related to planning are to be carried out, and the ways in which First Nations must be involved and informed of those studies. We also talked, we also saw a lot about culture and settlement history. Those kind of started emerging from plans that came out around probably like the late 90s, early 2000s. You started seeing a trend where maybe just at the beginning of some of these official plans or as part of the kind of cultural discussion of official plans, there's different ways that First Nations peoples are being acknowledged as part of the culture and part of the settlement history of the land. It was kind of around, you know, these people were here at this time, and then these Europeans interacted with them, and from there they, you know, would maybe spread around the land a certain way. And that's kind of what the culture and settlement history piece looks like. Culture could also look like, as we mentioned before, with the Moccasin project that Carolyn's a part of. Sometimes culture looks like design. Sometimes it looks like collaborating with different Indigenous peoples to have monuments or art or building design implemented that either was collaborated on with Indigenous communities or comes from Indigenous designers, or you know, those kind of different things. There was also a lot of talk around, you know, as a part of this official plan, the municipality may endeavor to come up with a culture master plan, and that would involve collaboration and consultation with Indigenous communities. Environmental impact studies, that again, it was kind of like archaeology. It came up every so often, and it was usually in reference to the Environmental Assessment Act and what's required under the Environmental Assessment Act. The consultation and collaboration, kind of, you're starting to see more of it coming up in some of the newer official plans that are coming out. So after the 2014 provincial policy statement came out, again, it had those clauses that encourage consultation and collaboration with Indigenous communities. And so you are starting to see it more in official plans. Sometimes it's as simple as we will consult with communities on this matter. It's one line and it's done. Sometimes it's more, we recognize that as part of the official plan and part of consulting and engaging with Indigenous peoples, there needs to be a process that needs to be implemented. So sometimes the official plans talked more about what that would look like. And sometimes they were actually guidelines on this. These are the people that we will connect with. These are the communities we will connect with, and this is how we will carry out our consultation. So there's varying degrees of how that's being recognized in official plans. So I wanted to take a little bit of time and highlight some of the interesting official plans that we came across. Essex County was interesting because it kind of hit on all of those different notes in one way or another, all those different themes that we came across. So here you can kind of take a look and read what some of the clauses were in that official plan. Again, you're talking about cultural heritage. It's not the best acknowledgement that I've seen of cultural heritage, because it just say First Nation settlements and activities. It doesn't point out any specific communities. It doesn't say specifically where they were within Essex County. But I mean, it's a start. You also see that the appropriate First Nations shall be provided notification. There's nothing wishy-washy about it. They're saying we will provide them with notification. They will be invited to participate in the process. There is a little bit of an issue with notification that I've learned during my time with Shared Path. From what I've been told, it's very easy for First Nations to be inundated with notifications from municipalities, to the point where it just turns into rooms full of boxes of documents of notifications, and it actually becomes harder to navigate the process because, you know, there's just not enough resources within some of these band offices to deal with being inundated with so many notifications. It also says here the county may prepare a cultural heritage management plan. So that's kind of what I was talking about before. You're kind of setting the stage for something more to be done without actually, you know, committing to what exactly that's going to look like. I also thought that this part around the consultation was interesting and very important. So here it says county council and local municipal councils shall actively engage meaningful public participation by seeking the opinions and advice of First Nations, Métis individuals, and community and stakeholder groups in the ongoing task of implementing, monitoring, and reviewing this plan. So the thing that I want to hit on here that's really important is that it's an ongoing task. It's not something that you do a one-off. It's not something that you consult one time and you're done. It's an ongoing task that requires an ongoing relationship. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in some of my later slides. It also says prior to making decisions related to planning matters, county council and the local municipal councils will encourage appropriate steps to be taken to resolve conflicting issues associated with the proposal. Again, it's not totally perfect. You would hope that, you know, we will resolve conflicts before going ahead with decision making, but just even acknowledging the fact that, you know, taking the appropriate steps, maybe the next best thing would be to define what the appropriate steps are, to work with First Nations to define what those appropriate steps would be, so it's not just being implemented by a municipality, but actually agreed upon by the different parties. That might be a positive next step for it. But I just thought that Essex County had a really interesting approach to their official plan. I also wanted to talk about York Region. Full disclosure, Ron Williamson, he's in on this presentation somewhere, and he, I believe, was a consultant on this official plan. And I wanted to highlight it because it's not a perfect document. There's some room for improvement, but in terms of the way that they discuss archaeological resources and First Nations is pretty exceptional from all of the examples that I've seen so far. So for example, when they're talking about the cultural heritage, they name the nations that are still on the land. They acknowledge those who have occupied the land previously. They also talk about a brief history of the York region, and so they talk about the movement of the Anishinaabeg speaking peoples through the region, how they kind of dispersed, where the Huron-Wendat went to. It's really just like a kind of a nice story to read as you're going through this official plan, and it's very accessible. They also talk about archaeological resources, and I think that this is really interesting, and I think this is a really forward way of thinking. It says that First Nation or Métis significant archaeological resources shall be considered resources that are preferably to be protected in place unless it is demonstrated that preservation in situ is not reasonable in the circumstances. The consultant archaeologist shall engage those First Nations or Métis with the closest cultural affiliation and in whose traditional territories the significant archaeological resource is situated to identify commemorative approaches to assist in maintaining heritage integrity of the site. So the idea that you should just leave something in the ground or leave something that where you found it in archaeology is not an old idea, from what I understand, from what I've heard about it. And leaving it up to the discretion of First Nations people to do what they will with artifacts or, you know, burial grounds or whatever it may be that people have come across, and giving them the option to decide what to do with it is something that, I mean, it's maybe loosely referenced just in some of those one-off sentences in other official plans, but here to actually say those words and to give those options, I thought was really powerful. The one thing that I do find problematic about York Region's official plan, again, just from my learning with Shared Path and with the stuff that I've been doing throughout my master's degree, is that there is a lot of focus on the historical, and there's not a ton of focus on the present and futures of Indigenous peoples as decision makers in land use planning. Some of that is done on a case-by-case basis. You do see, you know, environmental impact studies where they speak about, or they write about who exactly they will be consulting, etc. But you know, in the official plan, there is not really a lot of language around these people will be explicit decision makers on matters of land use planning. Right. Bruce County. Morgan and I were talking about this this morning and last night, and it's probably the most progressive out of all of the different official plans that we found so far. I didn't list everything here because the section is just so long and there's so much content and it's really excellent, but it would have just totally inundated your screens. But the official plan speaks not only to Indigenous culture, archaeology, history, but it also actually speaks to housing, economic development, environmental impact studies, and they have a whole section that talks about just official plans, consultation, and relationship development. So you can kind of read on the screen here exactly what they're saying. You know, the county recognizes the desire of First Nations communities to be consulted. It recognizes there's many areas of concern related to new development proposals. It recognizes that meaningful consultation is a difficult thing to come up with, but they talk about needing to have some sort of communication protocol in place and exactly what would need to be you know, involved in that process. They also talk about working with the Crown and First Nations towards a formalized consultative process, and what the county shall do as part of coming up with that process. You know, continuing to provide notice, continuing to provide open dialogue with chiefs, band councils, and representatives, assisting First Nations and Métis representatives in obtaining information on development applications. So not necessarily just like throwing a notification at them, but actually, you know, helping them dive into what the documents mean. And having regard to results of a study being undertaken by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation on interior travel routes, former settlement areas of past use when it is available. So acknowledging information that is coming from communities, which I think is really important. All I'd say about that? Yes, it is. I also wanted to talk about Algonquin Highlands. I wouldn't say that their official plan is like it's super stellar, but I would say that it is interesting that they talk about interjurisdictional coordination here. So they say here, the township recognizes that there are a number of planning matters that influence not only the township, but other jurisdictions as well, such as federal, First Nations, Métis, provincial, and county, as well as crossing municipal boundaries. So far, there's only one other official plan that I've come across that has any similar language, and that was in Shelburne. They have kind of a similar statement. And it's really interesting to me that they're kind of including, or not kind of, that they're including Indigenous peoples as part of this acknowledgement. That, you know, maybe some work needs to be done beyond what is legally required of a planner in terms of you know, interjurisdictional coordination. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the interviews that I did with board members. So as part of my work with Shared Path, I am working on an article that I believe will be published in OPPI at some point in the future. I think there's been a couple of shifts because of what's going on with current events and the COVID pandemic. But I had the opportunity to interview most of the board members. They were really interesting conversations, and there were two kind of main themes that I was able to extrapolate from these conversations. The first was really around the need to develop planners' understanding of Indigenous land use, the implementation of treaties, and the ways in which they are still relevant today. The treaties are still relevant today. There's a lot of discussion around, you know, having planners understand not only, you know, that Indigenous land use planning is a thing that existed for a long time before settlers came to this continent, but also that that they're still relevant today. They're still documents. They're still, you know, you can still take traditional territory to as evidence in court if you need to. You can still recognize, I guess, the need to understand these histories and to implement them into the way that you're doing land use planning. I think also that part of that is understanding that land use planning has been used, has been kind of weaponized against Indigenous communities, and there are things that need to be reconciled in that realm. The other thing that came up pretty frequently in these interviews is developing proactive relationships between First Nations and municipalities, rather than kind of having reactive conversations around conflict resolution. So that's kind of what Dean is talking about here in this quote. He says, all relationships require maintenance, and sometimes with communities of First Nations, it requires heavy duty maintenance to continue that relationship. But if you have the regular ongoing engagement, then you don't have to do the heavy duty stuff later on. And I think that as planners, we kind of have this idea that there's a systematic process that we have to go through, and, you know, everything kind of has to be codified and everything has to be very professional and official. But in these conversations that I had with some of the board members, you know, they talked about it being as simple as the chief of a First Nation and the mayor of a municipality going out for lunch once a month and just kind of talking about what's going on in their communities and having an understanding of, you know, just like a friendship, just, you know, being aware of what concerns the other person has about what's going on, and creating a dialogue that's not just centered around conflict resolution. So I thought that was pretty powerful, and I think that it's a lesson we're sharing with other people in the planning realm. So I'm coming to the end. I just wanted to wrap up with some lessons that I took away and some opportunities for further research. one of the things that I think, as I mentioned earlier, learning about and mapping traditional territories in planning context, I think would be really helpful. I think that it's something that people in this realm have expressed to me that would be helpful to them and interesting to them, and help with that kind of learning and engagement part of the discussion. Also coming up with actionable policies versus passive statements of recognition. So rather than saying, you know, we recognize that so-and-so was on this land from this time to this time until these settlers came in. Like, it's good to know that history, but it's also good to say, now that we know that history, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to improve things? How are we going to build a relationship? The next thing that would kind of help with that, improving planning capacity within First Nations. As I mentioned, you know, one of the discussions that came up during my interviews was the fact that so many First Nations, when they do receive notifications from municipalities, they can just be totally inundated with them, and they don't necessarily have the capacity to address everything, all of the application developments that come their way. At the same time, I think that we need to better prepare municipalities to engage with First Nations. I think that no matter who it comes from, there really has to be opportunities for municipalities to do this learning, to have this history, and to come up with processes, whether it's protocols, whether it's agreements, whatever it looks like, to better engage with First Nations. And those things should be collaborative. Those things should not just come from municipalities on their own. Finally, to all of those ends, I think we really need to find a way to prioritize resource allocation to these areas of development and research. So we need money put into this, we need time put into this, we need people to do this research, and that's the only way that we're going to build these better relationships and to move forward and to plan kind of more cohesively than we have before. One of the things that Morgan and I have talked about doing with this research, it's still ongoing, and it will be posted at some point once we have it all completed. But we've talked about maybe with some sort of grading scheme for official plans. So kind of looking at all of the different aspects that I've talked about in this discussion, and, you know, pointing out what is really good, what is really bad, what could be improved upon, maybe areas of improvement. And so we're hoping to make that document something that planners can use as they're engaging with this work in their own municipalities. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I want to say thank you so much to all the folks at Shared Path. You guys have been so welcoming and you've been so helpful. I've really learned a lot during this experience. And yeah, that's it for me for now. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Dali. I see some questions coming in the Q&A. We're going to get to those after David's presentation, but please continue to submit those questions. We might end up going a little bit past the hour, so I hope everyone can stay for that piece. If not, we are recording this session. So let me just share my screen again here. And Shared Path is fortunate to have individuals with a great depth of knowledge and experience on our board. And one of them is our next presenter, David Stinson. David is a registered professional planner and a member of the Canadian, or former member of the Canadian Institute of Planners Indigenous Community Planning Committee. He has expertise in rural development and land use policy, and he's worked for public, NGO, and private sector organizations, including the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority and the Kent County Planning Department. David is a professor at the Aurelia campus of Laurentian University, and for 7 years he has been the community planning advisor for the Ogamawa, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation, Tribal Council. He has provided research and analysis on community economics, land development, and environmental planning, and he is now a partner at Insight Planning. And he has recently been appointed to the Lake Simcoe Coordinating Committee. So I'd like to welcome David, and please unmute yourself and take it away from here.
Okay, hi everyone. I just want to start by saying thanks, Dali, for the for this great overview of this. This is groundbreaking work, and we're really pleased that that we have you to help out with this. What follows here is an introduction to evaluating the effectiveness of plans and their processes and their policies. Next slide, Morgan. This is a ladder of citizen power devised by Sherry Arnstein in the 1960s. It's a method for assessing the level of participation that citizens have in controlling the decisions that are made for them. I've chatted with planning students over the past number of years, and they're still being taught this system. I was taught it in school, and I've been rather discouraged actually about how rarely it's used in actual planning practice. And when it is used, it's more or less unconscious, or it's done very poorly. And for anybody who wants to take the time to think about it, think about any public engagement that you've been involved in, either professionally or privately, and think about the effect that that has had, or the level of participation that has been allowed by the public. When I was in school, I was told that at that time, the best we can do was right about level 4 to level 5, somewhere between consultation and placation. Next slide, Morgan. In terms of participation, Sherry grouped the spectrum into 3 general participation categories: non-participation at the lower end, tokenism in the middle, and citizen power at the upper end. Next slide. If we overlap the parameters of consultation with the spectrum of participation, we get a ladder of consultation. What I've listed here are various examples for each of them. While the honor of the Crown does involve a responsibility to inform, using information to manipulate or to therapize a community does not fulfill the honor of the Crown and constitutes non-consultation. When we move up to the consultation level, it often simply amounts to providing information, or only asking for advice, or at best providing a minimal response to addressing the concerns. The accommodation level starts to be realized when communities are treated as actual partners, or they're entrusted with actual decision-making, or even in charge of the process. Next slide, Morgan. I'm going to go through a couple of examples here, just to illustrate the point. The first one, I had to add another step to the ladder. Right at the bottom, I give it a 0, and I've called it contempt. A particular community that I was working with became a party to an Ontario Municipal Board hearing because of the effects of a subdivision that was planned right next to its territory. The planner who was involved with the project was also a member of the professional regulating body, or OPPI for you planners out there, called me and proceeded to describe all the problems that he thought the community had, and that they had better things to do than protest this particular development, and that the developers didn't want a bunch of yahoos screwing up the project. And yes, he did use the word yahoos. Now, in all fairness, he may have meant the municipal staff, he may have meant me, he may have meant the First Nation, or the whole lot of us. Needless to say, this ranked as non-consultation. The next example I want to look at was a recent case a couple years ago regarding the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, who was consulted on a development of a quarry license. And the consultation file was so badly handled by the Ontario government that the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation took them to court. Now, what the court said, they felt that the level of participation that was required was not only formal notice or giving information, they also felt that peer review funding and accommodation of their concerns was required. It's worth noting that the third party in this instance, the quarry proponent, was not obliged to accept the delegation of consultation from the government. However, the court did say that their non-participation risked delaying their own project. Another example that I have here that kind of goes up the scale a little bit, quite a ways actually, was a planning commission that was set up by the Yukon territorial government to develop a plan for something called the Peel watershed. And I do mean the Peel watershed in the Yukon, not the Peel watershed in Ontario. And it was based on the full participation of the local First Nations as well as the public. Now, what the government did when the plan finally came in is it rejected the recommendations of its own commission and arbitrarily altered the plan. Now, the First Nations and conservation groups took the government to the Yukon Supreme Court, which found that the government did not respect the land use planning process set out in the territorial's final agreement with First Nations. This happens to be one of these more modern day treaties that had been written. After a 5-year process of using ecosystem planning-based principles, First Nations had the right to be consulted and to be full participants in the land management of that particular watershed. Now, the case eventually was taken to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Yukon First Nations won the fight to protect the Peel watershed. The court said that the territorial government was not respectful of the treaty's process, and it had made changes to the plan that included First Nations traditional territories. In other words, the lack of participation in the changes was not becoming of the honor of the Crown. The actual plan itself was signed last year, I believe, almost about 10 months ago. And one of the elders from one of the communities said, finally, we are now able to sit at the decision-making table when deciding the fate of our ancestral lands. Next slide, Morgan. You'll notice on the scale, I've also added another level at the top of the scale, a level 9. And what I'm proposing here is that perhaps we include the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the top level of this scale of engagement and consultation. It was done in 2007, and it contained a very, very important notion, that is free, prior, and informed consent on lands and resources of Indigenous peoples. 129 nations voted in favor of it, 11 abstained, and there were 4 countries that voted against it. They were Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. When you think about that, it's either countries that have a fairly large percentage of their population as Indigenous, such as New Zealand, or they are countries that have very large territories, such as the rest. Eventually, these countries signed the protocol. Canada was a laggard and didn't sign until 2016. Now, almost immediately, the government was taken to court by the Mikisew Cree in Alberta because of a failure to consult over legislation. And there may have been jurisprudence reasons or constitutional reasons for the way this decision came down. The court said that they did not have the need to consult over legislation. However, it did make the government's statements on this look like window dressing. So it's very unfortunate the way that all played out. What I'd like to do is take a look at an example from Ontario that's, if not quite at level 9, at least has aspirations of going in that direction. And it involved the Community Economic Development Initiative in Peterborough County. This initiative is a collaboration between the Council for the Advancement of Native Development Officers and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Now, the basic mandate of the initiative is to help neighboring municipalities and First Nations develop partnerships essentially around economic development. But they do have a little clause in there that they will work on land use planning issues as well. And the initiative was launched in Peterborough County several years ago. I think we may have several people involved in that initiative on the line, so I'm hoping I get this right. But I'll describe the basic players involved. They were the Peterborough and Kawartha Lakes Economic Development Corporation and Curve Lake First Nation. These were the first partners. And once they started collaborating and started discussing things, it became very apparent to some other players that they might like to join the process as well. This included Hiawatha First Nation, the Township of Selwyn, the Township of Autonomy South Monaghan, and the County of Peterborough itself. Now, the outcome has been rather interesting. Because the project, when it started, basically took the communities from what I would call level 4 consultation level right up to level 6, the actual partnership between municipalities and the First Nations. Now, in the project's finalization stage, the players had moved up to some levels of delegation, some levels of collaboration, again, aspiring towards level 9, if not, maybe not quite getting there. The actual on-the-ground effects of this are that the two First Nations, Curve Lake and Hiawatha, now sit on the technical review committee for the official plan. The county has used its GIS to begin to buffer streams and rivers that are sensitive to First Nation issues as well as archaeological issues. And the Township of Selwyn has begun to streamline its consultation process. Again, instead of sort of inundating the First Nations with every request that comes along, the process is now in place that will begin to notify the communities of specific things that they're interested in, rather than everything. A couple of side benefits of this are that the city of Peterborough has begun to take notice of this, and they are starting to talk with some of the communities as well. In terms of shared path, I believe we are going to use this template in an initiative that was supposed to start this year, but COVID has kind of cut that, it's kind of put that on hold. But we're going to be working with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and the County of Bruce to try something of a similar nature in hopefully in the near future. Next slide, Morgan. Finally, just sort of for fun here, I thought I'd take a look at the provincial planning, the provincial policy statement. It became effective in May of this year. And I just took a look at the verbiage there and tried to pull out things that I thought were relevant to this topic. And what you can see there, there's part 4, the vision, section 1.2 on coordination, section 2 on wise use, as well as section 4 on implementation. Next slide, Morgan. What we have here in the vision part are a fair bit of language, some regarding Indigenous communities in terms of their unique relationship to the land, their unique role that they might play in planning, the idea of that traditional knowledge and their perspectives might have something to offer land use planning. Again, specific language around Aboriginal communities and specific reference to Section 35 of the Constitution. Planning authorities are encouraged to build constructive relationships. They're encouraged to engage and to share knowledge. Next slide, Morgan. In terms of section 1.2.2, very bold statement here. Planning authorities shall engage with Indigenous communities and coordinate on land use planning matters. Next slide. I threw this one in because I thought it was important to emphasize this statement about wise use and the management of resources, again, all being something that supports our prosperity, environmental health, or social well-being, all being dependent on biodiversity and health of the Great Lakes and protection of natural heritage and archaeological resources and minerals, agriculture. I isolated this out and made a point of emphasizing it because almost every First Nation, as well as the Métis Nation of Ontario, also feel that these elements are important for their lives and their sustenance and their continued success. Next slide. Again, this is another statement, a very bold one. Planning authorities shall engage Indigenous communities and consider their interest when identifying, protecting, and managing cultural heritage and archaeological resources. Next slide. In terms of the implementation, again, there are two references here. One is to Section 35 of the Constitution, specific reference to the Aboriginal and treaty rights. There's also a reference to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I mentioned that because Section 25 also talks about rights of Aboriginal communities. I think it's very encouraging that the PPS wants to see comprehensive and integrated plans in municipalities, and that they have to be kept up to date with the PPS. Very wise idea. Next slide. There's also verbiage on the Environmental Assessment Act as well as the Planning Act, and trying to integrate these two processes. Both of them make references to engagement, and it would be very nice to see both of these things collaborate and integrate in a much more thorough manner. I'm also very encouraged by this notion of evaluation. As any of the planners in our audience will know, evaluation is often one of the weakest parts of the planning process. It often gets left behind because we're so busy doing other things. But it's very important that the evaluation is going to include consultation with municipalities, Indigenous communities, public bodies, as well as stakeholders. So I think that's very important language. Again, to reinforce this point, stakeholders are not the same thing as Indigenous communities. First Nations and the Métis Nation of Ontario are rights holders, not stakeholders. It's a great idea. Yes, we should talk to everybody, and that general notion of stakeholding is an important one in planning, and we should talk to everybody. But when it comes to First Nations, they have a priori rights that need to be recognized and taken into account in the planning process. Next slide. Again, this is just a little more for fun. I just thought it would be interesting to try and compare the PPS against itself. Have we made any progress since the 2014 version? And what I've done there is taking the statements that are seen in the two policy statements and sort of compared them. We have an encouragement to coordinate with planning with Aboriginal communities in the previous statement. I gave that a level 6, very aspirational, but it was a good statement. The idea of considering the interest of Aboriginal communities in dealing with cultural heritage, not as strong a statement. I gave that a level 4, and the PPS has to be consistent with the Constitution. I gave that a level 3, and if you simply take those and average them, you come up with 4.3. It's a very simple way of trying to get a kind of an objective feel for this. In 2020, we have a much bolder vision statement, a lot of interesting language. I think I still give it a level 6. I think it's right up there. The coordination section, level 6. I think the language there is good, and it's bumped us up a little bit. The statement on cultural heritage and archaeology, I think it's a stronger statement, and I think it's deserves a little better ranking, so I give it 5. And the implementation, again, it recognizes both Section 25 and Section 35 of the Constitution, so I bumped it up a little bit. So if I give it the average, that it comes out at 5.25. We're still in this 4 to 5 range, but we do seem to be improving. So I think there's some encouragement to be taken there with the new PPS. The only thing I think I have to add to that is that it will take time. It will take training. It will take funding to do this. Just like it has taken time, training, and funding for the First Nations who are involved in this. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, David. We are going to move into the Q&A session, and I hope everyone's been able to stay with us, but if not, no worries. We are recording this session. We'll make it available. So I've seen a few questions come in, and please feel free to keep submitting them. I want to let people know that also we're going to try to make a lot of this information available on our resource database, which I'll talk about near the end. So I'm going to invite David, Carolyn, and Dali back to do this Q&A. And we also have a few other Shared Path board members who are online and may jump in to help answer some of these questions. So the first one that came up, it's an interesting one here. And I'm not sure if I should direct this at a particular person, so please just put up your hand if you feel that you want to answer this. Are you aware of any Indigenous communities who made an appeal to the Ontario Municipal Board / the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, Ontario Land Tribunals, on the basis of PPS Policy 1.2.2, which is planning authorities are encouraged to coordinate planning matters with Aboriginal communities? And the person also noted that this policy was substantially changed in the 2020 PPS. But let's see, David, let's go to you first and see if are you aware of any communities who have done this?
Yeah, not off the top of my head, I'm going to say no, since this is fresh off the press, as it were. It's only went into effect in May, and we've been going through the COVID crisis and everything. So most things are kind of shut down. Nothing much is happening. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. If somebody knows of an example, I personally would really like to know. My experience with the Ontario Municipal Board was some years ago, and yeah, I very much failed to live up to this aspirational statement that we now have in the PPS. So it's I think and again, I'm quite willing to be corrected on this, but I think this has not been tested yet in the new system. If anybody knows of an example that has gone, please give Shared Path a call, or give me a call, or we would like to sort of be kept apprised of these. That would be very significant if it happened. I don't want to chat too much longer on it, but if a community went to the new board, the new tribunal, it would be a very, very fascinating test of this new system, if it's actually functioning, or whether it's was all window dressing.
Thank you, David. Carolyn, have you heard of anything? No, okay. So let us know if you hear of this happening, and we'd be interested to see how it plays out. Another question here to do with consultation, I think it fits quite well into David's presentation. What does the term consultation entail in practice? That's a big question. Is it executive power of decision-making, or merely informing? What is the present trajectory of collaboration, and has it been improving? And in what ways should it be moving forward? So David touched on that in his presentation. Did you want to elaborate any more on that, David?
Sure. The way I look at it, and you may have seen it in the structure of the way I presented things, at the bottom level, there's notification. Sometimes, in the past, notification simply didn't happen. Now we're into the era of notification. Sometimes too much notification becomes a problem. That's very low-level stuff. Consultation is the next step. And consultation is essentially means asking someone for their advice. In the past, this has gotten confused. They say, well, we sent you a letter. Well, that's simply informing us. Consultation is when you actually come to us and sit down with us and have a conversation about the advice that we could give you on this particular matter. That's the way I look at consultation. But the next step above that is accommodation. When you actually take the advice that you heard into account and make your decision based on that advice, and begin to alter your plans and the project that you have in mind with that advice in mind. And that's sort of those three levels of that I outlined there. At the very upper ends of that, we're looking at something like a collaboration and a partnership and actually making decisions together. We're a long way from that. Like I said in the presentation, there's a very encouraging example occurring in Peterborough County right now. I believe, I think I failed to mention, I'll mention it now, the results have been fairly affirmational. A friendship cord has been developed, and elders from the two communities, I believe, were involved in the creation of wampum belts, which have been exchanged. I think it happened last year. Again, if somebody from the one of those communities is in on this discussion, let us know. I think it's already happened. That is astounding. I mean, wampum belts are not sort of handed out willy-nilly just for fun. They do signify something substantive. And the parties involved, the Curve Lake First Nation, Hiawatha First Nation, have felt that this has been such a good process that we needed to commemorate that with the exchange of wampum belts. So it's probably one of the best examples of that upper end that I was talking about. Again, I'm not sure we're quite there at level 9, but it's a very encouraging example, and it's, I think, something that most of the municipalities in Ontario should be encouraged to pursue.
Thank you, David. Carolyn, did you want to add anything to that? You're just going to have to unmute yourself. Let's see.
Okay.
And we still can't hear you, so try one more time.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Did that go? Okay. Well, I see things are more things are happening. I don't work for the First Nation on duty to consult and accommodate, but I did spend, many years there, and after the consultation, duty to consult came into play. So I was here for 4 years on a project, and that representing the First Nation. So I was part of some of the presentations that were made, and certainly have learned a lot in representing the First Nation in that field. And I see that the municipalities want to do something, in some cases don't know, and are restricted by their own councils because of as David explained, or I think as Dali explained about mostly were considered federal lands. And I'm going to make a side note. I find it interesting right now under COVID how the First Nations are now treated separately, because the rules for the province don't apply to the First Nations. And it become very, what I say, significant when the First Nations shut down their borders. And that people like say, why? Who are they? How can they do that? And that I think it's been a real learning lesson, or maybe not a lesson, but an awareness about the power of the First Nation to do things for itself. And that, so being part of a planning process, I think should just show the municipalities it's important to include the First Nations. I've got my duty to consult maps behind me, and the one map up there, which is Haldeman Brant, there. You see the brown spot in there, that's the size of the Six Nations New Credit community. So there's no mistaking how big some of the land is. And, if we're federal people, if we're in charge of our own lands, and we have a say about what's going on around us, waters flow through our lands, and that, it can have an impact on the adjacent municipalities on their impacts. So, yeah, in that, it's happening, and our ability to participate, like like on the when we talked about implementation, that we're brought in to sit on implementation committees to start to design parks and design conservation areas, and it takes a lot of time and know how to do that. And when if the municipality doesn't understand that, it gets we end up looking bad because we can't get in there and be on every at every table and give all the inputs that's needed. So I think the municipalities need to realize that it's, how difficult that it is for our people. So our citizens at the Mississaugas, our little environmental group, we're sitting on several committees free just to make sure that we're in, otherwise, they'll go on talking about us and never include us in the real plans and about way things are happening. But I'm optimistic.
And Carolyn,
things
that
are happening.
Another question here that are you aware of any Indigenous communities who are any nations advocating and are working with the province to simultaneously change the Planning Act to ensure legislative processes for consultation and notification reflect their rights and interests? And I'm going to just make a plug for Shared Path here, because we did put together a policy committee to make some comments on the review of the PPS 2014. So Shared Path is trying to bring people together to do that kind of work, but I know that Carolyn has been taking that on for quite a while. So did you want to mention one or two things about that, Carolyn?
Well, I think that we're at the table now, and that the First Nations have been starting to recognize their strength in the system, and that they're willing to go forward and, in some cases not be jeopardized because they spoke up and protected their lands and the right for protecting the whole environment around them and their impacts that can happen from a development. We're in Southern Ontario, so I can only speak for that. The impact of highways, big highways and big development. And, I watched the planning processes around our community, and we're getting boxed in more and more, and that we have to be cognizant of, if the PPS said about the cultural, the environment, and how that's going to be impacted. I see it, I feel it right now, with the highway development and mega developments of residential development, say in Caledonia or Hagersville. Even our whole areas around us are in major planning development and a lot of residential development. And ultimately that means highways. And they cut through the lands and bring a lot of different people into the area. So yeah, I think that we are being talked to, or sit at the table. Our duty to consult, our office goes to the table, and certainly the Six Nations have a huge consultation office that they can go to the table with, and the other communities. I've sat at the table with the Williams Treaty Bands and for the past activities, and I think Curve Lake has done some very good work in getting their story down and protecting the rights. I see that there's an upcoming event on CBC about the environment and the First Nations cottagers. It's coming up, and the situation we know in Alderville, Curve Lake, about the rice. The traditional pursuit of planting and harvesting wild rice, and that how that impacts the water of the cottagers who want to just be able to go around in a boat type thing. I've even heard the comment that it said that the cottagers said that the First Nations were devaluating the land. So see, those kinds of comments start to raise the ire of the First Nation when there are ways and means are not considered in the right perspective about how we should be seen and recognized. So comment there.
Thank you for that, Carolyn.